Well, thank you so much, Professor Granis, and everyone here for inviting me, as you say, back again, because I've been here before. Although not in this building, I had always been at the castle before, so this is another side of the university that I have not seen before. When Anka told me that the conference was going to be about places of African philosophy, I could hardly say no to that because, as she mentioned, place has been one of my central concerns in philosophy for going on 30 years, I would say. And what I want to do with you here today is to tell you about some of that research that's gone on over that time, and in particular tell you about two, if you wish, research focuses or projects having to do with place that hardly ever have overlapped for me. So if I am among Africans and African philosophers, it's very common for me to talk about what I call philosophy in place. And I'm going to explain what that means a little bit for those that are not familiar with it in a moment here. But if I'm among architects and geographers and sociologists and environmentalists and people like that, all of which I hang around these people as well, I talk about place very differently. It's a different kind of research program on place. And so what I want to do is to kind of distinguish those two and describe them a little bit each for you, but then bring them together. And in bringing them together, I think there's some interesting potentialities for African philosophy. We talk a lot about place, and I talk about philosophy in place, but we don't really unpack what that actually means, what place actually means. Well, that's exactly what I do with the architects and the geographers and all of those folks. So these two projects, philosophy in place on the one hand, and what I'm calling charting and networking place on the other hand, are these two projects. So let me just tell you the story of the first one, how it came to be. It came to be in philosophy in part not because of what I did, but because of people that came before me, particularly Edward Casey. Casey is a philosopher, or he's retired now, but he was a philosopher in New York State. And he was one who recognized that the discussions about place in Western philosophy had really faded away, especially in the modern era. He looked back to the ancients and saw that they were quite concerned about the notion of place, what it meant to be in a place, what a place meant in relationship to being in space. You can find that among ancient philosophers. You can find it sometimes in medieval philosophers. But his argument basically was that once we come to the modern era, space takes over as the kind of dominant concept, and place recedes into the background. And it's really only in the 19th and early 20th century, he claims, he argues, that it has a resurgence. And it has a resurgence in part because there's greater attention through phenomenology to human experience and lived human experience. And if you're going to have lived human experience, it has to be lived in a place. You have people who don't actually use the word place, such as Heidegger, who, in English we talk about dwelling or inhabitation, which is really place talk. And so throughout the kind of early to mid 20th century, we start getting a much more a swing of the pendulum back towards thinking about place rather than space. You can see it in the maps in the early days of the modern era, whereas in the medieval maps, often they are maps of places. So you can look at a medieval map and you can see the important places. Maybe Jerusalem shows up, for example. You know it's a religious map if that's the case. Maybe it's at the center of the map. Maybe, in fact, the map is oriented with east at the top, right? Which would imply that if you're in Europe, you're going up to Jerusalem, right? So the direction is important. But do you map the ocean? No, because there are no places in the ocean, right? The places are where people would actually go, but if it's no place, you don't map it. It's not important. That's what you see in many, many medieval maps. As soon as you hit the modern era, you map the ocean. You put down lines of longitude and latitude, and maybe you can't even really understand when you're traveling exactly what those are. It took a long time before we understood exactly what that meant in terms of travel. But in terms of mapping, yes, you mapped ocean because now it's mapping of space, not place. And so space becomes predominant. throughout the modern era, and we can see that in visual representations as well. So Casey published many things on place, but this is another book, actually came out before the previous one I showed you, The Fate of Place. And in this one, he really tries to get into the question of what it means for humans to inhabit a place, what it means for us to understand the places in which we find ourselves. And so he writes quite a lot about wilderness. He writes a lot about nature, things of this sort. And so the idea is to think about how we are inextricably connected to our places. In other words, it's not just something incidental about us. It is something that is at the very core of our existence. And so that idea is taken further by people like Jeff Malpass, very important philosopher who's written on place. If you're interested in the philosophy of place, Casey and Malpass really are the ones who to start with, really. But there are dozens, hundreds of others who are also writing about these concepts. And so what they're doing really is to say place is not just an incidental concept like other concepts that we philosophers might consider. It is at the core of what we are and who we are as humans. And so it needs to have a kind of predominance. And they trace it through a number of modern authors to show how ideas like embodiment, for example, the body is our first place. It is the first place that we inhabit, and we relate to the rest of the world in embodied terms. Many of our concepts come from our embodied experience in the world. And so, the notion of place takes on a much more significance within the philosophical corpus. So what I tried to do in the book that was already mentioned, Philosophy in an African Place, was to look at a question about place that had not really been asked, even by these really wonderful erudite writers that had come before, which is, what is it to do philosophy in a place? What implications does place have for philosophy itself? Often we think of philosophy as something that rises above place. Our concepts are universals. That means they don't have a place, right? If we talk about truth, if we talk about knowledge, if we talk about ethics, all of those are supposed to kind of be universal concepts that can apply to everywhere and anywhere. And yet we know as philosophers that we are emplaced just like everyone else. We do not get a pass on being in place. We do not get to rise to the level of the gods. We too are in place. But what does that mean for our actual practice as philosophers? I think it means a lot. And so as I started to get into African philosophy, and that was in part through the kind of persistent tugging of my old friend Emmanuel Eze, who really brought me into the field originally, he and I talked about place quite a lot. And what I came to realize is that a lot of the questions that I was seeing in African philosophy, which were around identity, which were around questions of ownership over ideas, which were responses to really a European rejection of African philosophy, right? The central question for many people of African philosophy is there an African philosophy? And I always took that question to be a challenge, and a challenge from outside of Africa to Africans. Prove to me that there is an African philosophy. Prove to me. The onus is on you. Prove it to me. And what is it that you're supposed to prove? You're supposed to prove that what the thought is truly African, not just came in from somewhere else, not just kind of flowed in from Europe or something like that. Truly African and truly philosophy. That is not just folktales, not just religion, not just something else. Truly philosophy. You got to have both of those things. That's the implication of the challenge. And I thought that is an illegitimate challenge, because it's a question being given to Africa by those who don't really believe that there's philosophy there anyway. What if we change the question? What if we change the question to, what is it to do philosophy in this African place? So that means that we now have to start thinking, what does it mean to do philosophy in any place? What does it mean to link place to philosophy? Remember, I said often philosophers like to run to the universal as quickly as possible. What if we tether our instinctual move to the universal to the places in which we find ourselves? And then we exist in a kind of tension, right? I always feel Kierkegaardian here. existing in the finite and the infinite at once. We exist in this tension. We cannot leave our places. We are still human. We are not gods. And yet, we strive to think about universals. But we have to earn them. We don't just get them for free, right? We are earning them by reflecting on the places in which we find ourselves. And so this book really was an attempt to say, look, there are a number of concepts that have been used in African philosophy that have tried to answer the question, the illegitimate question, is there an African philosophy? And I went through a bunch of them and I said two things. Number one, they cannot succeed in that task. Number two, they can be core, super important concepts in this other question. What does it mean to do philosophy in an African place? And so there are concepts such as reason, language, culture, wisdom, concepts of this sort. And I just really kind of unpack them and say, look, if we give up that one question, we can answer a different question that's much more interesting and much more important. So, philosophy in place is this project. It's the project of asking, what does it mean to be emplaced as philosophers? To not, step outside the condition of humanity, which is to exist in place, and to do our philosophizing with place as an important kind of foundation of what we do. What does this accomplish? Well, it resists philosophy's tendency to universalize its methods, assumptions, and results. We now have to think about how we think in places. And that may not be a universal thing. Yeah, logic is great, but what if logic differs because of different imperatives in different places? Now we start taking seriously the long and illustrious history of Indian logic, for example. Right? If you look in traditional Indian texts, you find incredible logics worked out. Right? It resists essentialism of all sorts. It formulates a way of doing African philosophy that does not depend on first proving that such a thing exists. It provides a basis for philosophy and experience while resisting phenomenology's tendency to universalize that experience. And I say phenomenology, but there are a lot, that word means a lot of different things, let's put it that way. And there are a lot of phenomenologists, especially critical phenomenologists right now, that would totally agree with the move that I'm trying to make here. That is to ground phenomenology in experience that takes place seriously. It provides the basis to do more than just comparative or multicultural philosophy on the one hand, or exoticized ethnic philosophy on the other hand. So one concern that I found, especially when I was starting off, is that often in the West, when people thought about non-Western philosophy, what they thought about was some sort of comparison. So, let's look at some question that might have, that somebody outside the West might have had something to say about. Maybe it's a question around justice. Maybe it's a question of ethics. And then we'll sprinkle those things in. So here's the question, what do we say about persons? And look, a few Africans had something to say about persons. Let's bring those in. People from China had something to say. Let's bring those in. And so you sprinkle this stuff in, and that's what passed, I think, for intercultural philosophy. And that's pretty uninteresting as far as I'm concerned. It doesn't really engage the rich area of conversation that could be had between those things by just saying, here, a question has already been defined. Now let's go looking for the people who we might be able to cherry pick and put into that situation. So if we start from the notion of place or philosophy in place, what we're starting from is the idea that we are engaging the questions that matter to the people in a place, the concepts that matter that have emerged to account for that place. And now the conversation may use concepts, may use words that are similar, but those concepts might actually be subtly different or maybe quite different. My favorite one that I talk about to my students is the concept of race, right? And I point out to them that if you are in the United States, you may be considered black. If you're in Brazil, you may be considered white. And if you're in South Africa, you may be considered color. The same person, the very same person, could be under those categorizations in different places. What changed? Well, the person didn't change. The work that the concept is doing changed. Now that's interesting, right? Because that concept has developed in answer to a set of imperatives and a set of needs that exist in a place. Let's unpack that. Let's figure out what work is that concept doing in those places, and now we can start a conversation. Now it's an interesting conversation across those borders, because we're not deluding ourselves into thinking that we're using the same concept in all of those places, right? That's why place matters. So, I think when we think about philosophy in place, it's trying to show the work that concepts are doing, right? Philosophers have often tended to think about concepts as these kind of mental representations that rise above all of this. And in fact, I think they're doing some important work that we need to understand what exactly is happening. The other thing that they do is that they allow us to focus on the future and not just the past. In other words, we are not just thinking about how the past works conceptually, but what could we build? What is the potentiality? If we are thinking about a place, we are thinking about what concepts are necessary in order to build something new, right? I am faced with this question as a resident of Florida in the United States, and I'm sure you're all familiar with the political situation that's happening there. And I am thinking what concepts are adequate to this place, because every concept I've had so far seems to have been co-opted, seems to have been used against the academy, against people who would be trying to look out for diversity and things of that nature. Every one of those gets turned into a charge, into a weapon. What concepts are going to be adequate? I don't know the answer to that yet, but that is the question I think we ought to be asking. So let's move to the other project. This is the one that I talked to the social scientists and all the rest of those people about. And the project really came about in the, I guess the 1990s originally. And it came about because I just started assembling resources around the concept of place. And so this was when we first started getting search engines, and so I just plugged it into the search engine, place. Guess what came up? The entire internet. The concept of place, or the word place, is used everywhere. And it's used not, like going to grandma's place. That doesn't tell us anything about place necessarily, but it's a use of the term. And so I did what people did back then, which was to build a portal. So this is a picture of it, research on place and space. And what I did with this portal was really to try and painstakingly sift through the work that was on the internet that had something directly to say about the concept of place as compared to just incidental uses of it. And, I worked on this site for quite a while. It ended up with thousands of references on it. And if you kind of zoom in on the kind of menu system, and this is old school stuff here. I mean, nobody would build a site like this anymore. Nobody does portal sites anymore. This is, not interactive. You just click on stuff. It's ugly, But it was what we did at the time. You just be happy there's no dancing babies or shooting stars or something. But you can see what I did here. I had subpages in which I tried to sift out the uses of the term within disciplinary spaces. So I identified this group of kind of disciplinary spaces to begin with. And then I also tried to use kind of what I thought of as cognate terms. So you can see people who wrote about spirit of the place, a sense of place, a home, embodiment, landscape, gardens, travel, movement, speed, that was a category, borders, wilderness, non-places, loss of place. As soon as you start looking at this, you realize just how it just multiplies. There's just like lots and lots of stuff out there on this. Now, anyone who knows anything about building digital sites can probably see some of the problems that a site like this would run into. One of them is that an entry may well fit under multiple headings. And so what are you going to do? Are you going to duplicate it under those headings? Now if you build a database, you would just meta tag things, and you would just do searches for things, and everything under a meta tag would pop up, and it would be easy. I mean, you're still doing the work of meta-tagging, but this is a very static sort of approach to things. This was before, CSS even, for building sites. It was early stuff. But here's what it did. It helped me to realize the work that the concept of place was actually doing and the ways in which it was collecting itself under a number of, I guess I would call them nodes, right? Because I don't want these kind of categorizations to be too rigid. They feel like attractors on a map to me. But what I ended up with was 6 ways that we have thought about place and space. And sometimes these have more predominance in some disciplinary structures than others. But what you have here are these 6 ways. So let me just run. I'm not going to do everything on this because I've got a couple of kind of full charts here. But a lot of people, when they talk about place, they mean it in a very physical manner. And so they might want to be talking about it in terms of where an object is located, or they may be GIS, geographical information, or something of that nature. Mapping often follows under this. And so going all the way back to Euclid and Newton and Descartes, these people are talking about place in this very physical manner. And space, in a certain sense, is the range in which places are located. So that's one way that place and space get used. What I'm calling romantic or transcendental way is really where place is a kind of locus or manifestation of spirit. And so you start seeing this with romantics. I've mentioned Goethe and Novalis and Blake and Shelley and others like that here. So if you look at a place, it's a kind of macrocosm-microcosm relationship. Looking at a place opens you up to the whole world. Looking at the whole world allows you to see a particular place. And so you get this attention on, leaves and elements of nature and things like that, which are supposed to give you a certain kind of insight into the kind of built-in structure of the nature of things. So that's another way that I see people sometimes approach the notion of place. And you see that sometimes, especially in environmental writers. The third one, what I'm calling phenomenological and hermeneutical, and that's a lot of what you see in Edward Casey and Jeff Malpass and people like that. So, it's really about dwelling and inhabitation. What does it mean not just to incidentally be in a place, but to inhabit a place? So, I often talk to my students about the notion of embodiment. One exercise I run with them is to ask a student to leave the room, to walk out the door and then come back. And that's the first part. And then I ask them to pick up a chair or a desk or something and walk out of the room and bring it back in. And I ask them what the difference is between those 2 experiences. And they say in the first one, they just were wondering, I don't know why the professor is asking me to do this, but okay, I guess I'll do it. And they come back. The second one, though, they're saying, how do I maneuver this thing through? Like now it's an unfamiliar thing to me, and I have to somehow get it out this door and get it back in the door. And I point out to them that in a certain sense, they are now having to point their intentional consciousness at what is effectively their body, which is larger, right? They're carrying a chair, and it has effectively pushed their body further than they're familiar with, and now they have to think about it. Before, they didn't have to think about it because they thought with their bodies, right? Their bodies knew how to move through that space. But if your body doesn't know, let's say you're pregnant, and you're unfamiliar with how large you are going through doorways and things like that, now you have to think about it. You write with your pen until it breaks, and then you think about your pen, right? This is basically Heidegger stuff. But what it means is that our dwelling in place really is something that just makes up who we are. It's our cognitive experience of the world. It's not just something incidental to us. So that's the third one. Fourth one, what I'm calling the symbolic and structural notion of place. So this is where you have places understood as nodes that are connected to other things. So talk around globalization, for example, is about there being nodes that have their identity or have their meaning because of how they are connected to other things. There's lots of people, Michel de Certeau says that space is practiced place. That's his kind of nice, pithy little way of talking about that. Space is practiced place. So in other words, we have places in the world, and we do things in them, we practice them, we have our habitual actions in them, and that gives them their identity. Number 5, what I'm calling social constructivist and Marxian. So the great example here is Henri Lefebvre, and it really points at the idea that space itself, not place but space, is constructed from the material practices that we engage in. Not just the material things, but the kind of social and economic relationships that we have. And so that's what we need to look at. And finally, what I'm calling a transactionalist or causal or determinist notion of place and space. The idea that in a certain sense, places cause a certain kind of way of thinking. So you can often see this in people who do design for like retail spaces, for example, or restaurants. Like a fast food joint is going to try and get you to kind of come in and move through and get out fast. And so there are certain color choices, there's certain traffic patterns, there's certain, practices that you go through that are meant to facilitate that. A space that wants you to come in and sit and stay, it's going to be completely different from that. And so the place, in a certain sense, is designed in order to optimize certain kinds of behaviors and de-incentivize other kinds of behaviors. And so lots of psychologists of the environment think in those terms. And so I identified, and I'm not saying that these are the only categories possible or anything like that, but I do see different ways of thinking about place and space depending on the kinds of questions you're asking and what you're assuming about the work that place and space actually do. And what you end up getting is also failures of place and space, right? There are gaps. So you can, for the physicalist, the failure would be seeing space as idealist. That is not a feature of the world at all. The failure for a romantic would be not seeing the transcendent in the mundane, seeing everything as static and separate and not connected to everything else. The failure of place in the phenomenological would be the loss of human experience, placelessness, okay? And people have written about the notion of placelessness, the ways that modern urban design, for example, severs us from human connection, right? So that we end up being all separate beings instead of interacting with each other. I know some neighborhoods, some suburbs are like this. You move into a suburb and you don't know your neighbors. You get in your car and you drive somewhere and you drive home and then you never see the people across the street or the people next door. That's very different from other kinds of urban organization where you really are, you and your neighbors do have to interact at some point, and so that there's some shared human life there. The symbolic or structural, there's a failure in that space would be the loss of meaningful semiotic connections, non-place. Sometimes an airport is used as an example of a place in which all the signifiers point somewhere else, right? None of them point inside the airport, they all point outside. They all are meant to get you going somewhere else. And so you come into an airport not to have an experience of the airport, but to have an experience of moving through the airport to get to where it is you're trying to get to. Now, of course, there are movies. There's a movie, The Terminal, where somebody was in kind of visa limbo and ended up living in an airport, and so it becomes a place, but that's the irony of the movie, right? We don't expect an airport to be a place, right? We expect it to send us somewhere else, and yet here somebody ends up making it into a kind of home. If you work in an airport, it may well be a space of interaction and relationship and feel, like it has a homey quality to it. But for most of us, going through an airport, you know this to be true, your point is to get out of the airport and go somewhere else. So we can talk about non-place. The social constructivist or Marxian notion of the failure of place, and Lefebvre is kind of clear about this, is that he's not a big fan of the notion of place itself. He wants to talk about space. He thinks place is a kind of mystification. This is a kind of anti-Heideggerian sort of move that he makes. Whereas Heidegger talks about, showing ourselves who we are in places, Lefebvre wants to say, well, that obscures the material conditions in which you are able to do what you do, and you're romanticizing being in this place without really understanding that there are these material conditions. And finally, the transactionalist, causal, determinist notions, it's really about a loss of control of action through a lack of understanding of how place and human action interact with each other. And so, like I said, I'm not going to go through all of these. I don't know if this PowerPoint is going to be available, but if it is, you can check it out, or if you want to just email me, I can send it to you or whatever. But you can see it gets quite complicated here, right? I mean, if we're talking about place and space, that really does depend on what work we want those concepts to do for us as to the kind of ways that it's actually being used. So, I want to put these things together, these two projects. And what that means is that in the project of philosophy in place, I want to ask, what is that place in philosophy in place that we're actually talking about, and what difference does it make depending on how we're using different ways of thinking about that? And probably the place to start is to ask, what does the concept of place actually accomplish for us, right? We use concepts because they enable us to think in a place. They're not just dropped from the heavens. We develop them. We create them. This is, for anyone who knows Deleuze out there, Deleuze and Guattari, this is a very Deleuzian sort of notion that we create the concepts that are adequate to the places in which we find ourselves. So place can stand as a term of resistance or opposition. It can resist modernist structures and abstractive concepts of life by focusing in on, lived experience. It can resist postmodern dilations or deferrals of meaning, right, by saying, yeah, maybe nothing is truly meaningful out there, but this is what meaning is in this place in which I inhabit. It can resist the anomic, what I'm calling the anomic effects of globalization, where there's just too many connections, too much choice, just don't know what to do. Maybe place tells us what to do. Maybe in our places we can say, yeah, there's a million choices, but here we do this. Place tends to break down distinctions between disciplinary tendencies to explain the world and the artistic need to express it, and that is definitely a kind of tension sometimes. We may be philosophers here, but if you go to talk to a bunch of artists, their discussions are going to be quite different around place. They're going to be asking, what does it mean to capture this place, and not just the kind of livedness, the hominess of it, but maybe the contradictions within it. Maybe one person's home is another person's space of alienation, or even violence, or something like that. Maybe the home that we valorize, that some people valorize for a young gay person growing up, is very much a space of conflict and tension, right? And how do you capture those things? And the artist might want to, a writer or a visual artist or whatever might want to capture that. So I think the discussion between philosophers and artists becomes an interesting one if we start taking place seriously. I think it also breaks down the distinction between scholar and activist as well. And the researcher and researched distinction, right? I mean, in digital humanities, I know we think of the participants in our projects not just as sources of knowledge, but as partners, right? So we're working with a community of some sort, and we are trying to understand their way of understanding the world through using digital tools. We're trying to do visualizations and representations and make data available and all of that. But where it all comes down to is asking, how do we understand the world that you find yourself in? And does this representation that we're giving you help with that? Or does it actually undermine it? Does it kind of keep it static and unchanging, or something like that? Place offers complex narratives rather than reductive ones. It's something I'm very aware of. Living where I live right now, people love reductive answers to things. Very, very complicated problems. The simpler you can make an answer, the better. And so our current president loves simple answers. All sorts of problems. Well, it's the fault of immigration. Boom, let's just get rid of immigrants and it all goes away. That's a simplistic answer to a complex problem that has to ignore what happens in actual places. Place enables cultural reflection without essentialized assumptions, I think. It recovers particularity or exists at the edges of particularity and universality. That's the philosophers, that rubber band that we exist with between the particularity of place and the universality. I think it re-enchants the world as well, because for me, place is something where what I'm going to call event happens. And the notion of event, in some philosophical traditions, you'll be familiar with this. I mean, this is a term that Alain Badiou uses, Deleuze and Guattari use. You see it in Heidegger, you see it, and not all the same way, but it comes around the notion that in a place is where something can happen, something can change. You can have an idea, and it can exist abstractly in your mind, but as soon as you try and step out into a place, you find out what that idea is worth, whether you really understand it, whether it needs to be changed. It's a place of the possibility of your own self-reflection. I remember the first time I stepped into a classroom, and my assignment was to lecture about Kant. And I thought, I know Kant, no problem. Walked into the classroom, end of that hour, I realized just how much I did not know about Kant, right? Because it took stepping into that place, into that pedagogical place. I had it up here, sure, and then students started talking, and I had to say, yeah, that's a good question. Let me get back to you on that one. And that was a humbling lesson to me, and I would not have had it if I just stayed in my mind. The only reason that I had it is because I stepped into that place, and now the place makes clear things that were not clear before. So I want to suggest a number of ways in which all of these different notions of place can actually be relevant to how we think about African philosophy. And the first one is to think about what happens when we use these different models of place within African philosophy. So if we're asking the question, what is it to do philosophy in this African place, and I'm saying that it matters how you use the word place, then okay, let's look. If we're talking about physical place, is the point then to determine just where Africa is, who counts as African, those sorts of things? Does that answer the question of doing philosophy in an African place? Maybe at some level it does. How about a romantic place? Are we looking for a spirit of Africa? I know for some people that's what they're looking for, right? This somehow there's something African about a certain form of thought, that exists somehow. All I can say is in a spiritual manner. Not convincing to me, but there are people that look for that. Is it a phenomenological place? That is it about the human experiences of inhabitation in Africa in its realized, unrealized, and undermined potential? That's interesting. Is it a structural or semiotic place? So if so, what are the connections and signifiers? What has been suppressed or forgotten? Is it social constructivist? So what are the material conditions of production of African space? Is African place just a mystification of that? Finally, is it a causal or transactional place? If so, what does Africa actually afford? Or is it a combination of these? Remember, I don't want these to be rigid categories, and so I know I can think of a lot of people that work at the edges of two or more of these sorts of ways of thinking, but it's always work to do that. It's always some question to be solved when somebody does that. So here's another possible way that when you bring these things together, it might be interesting. Rejecting the notion of terra nullius. Well, we have, of course, and yet, there was this narrative in colonialism that Africa was no place, and therefore, being no place, it was ripe for somebody to move in and take it over. Now, we all know that that was not true. It was never true. But it doesn't actually tell us what the place is, other than denying that story, that convenient story that was used by colonizers. So just reversing the colonial claims about place still constructs African place on colonial terms. Is it terra nullius or not? Okay, so it's not. But do we know anything more about place than it's not terra nullius? So what are the options? Third, we could think about, as I've made this kind of Deleuzian claim that concepts are created in spaces of thought. So that means that concepts have a certain kind of currency. And so it's worth thinking about what concepts come from the African place. And when I'm using the term African in this sense, I'm going to use an idea that I developed in my first book, which is the notion of focal length. So we can coherently use the word Africa about the continent without denying that there are ways of talking about philosophy that does not encompass the entire continent. That is, your focal length is closer, as it were, into ethnic groups, into geographical regions, nations, into schools of thought, things of that nature. And as with any of us, we live in multiple places at the same time. I am a Canadian. I am male. I am standing in Hildesheim. I am, all of these things at once. And we navigate, multiple places, as it were, at once. This is how we make sense out of concepts like intersectionality. Sometimes those places are in tension with each other. And it's hard to understand from outside of somebody's experience what exactly it means. So if we're thinking about concepts in space of thought, we could do a number of things. We could look at the different narratives given to philosophy in different places. So the Koselleck project that was here at Hildesheim, I think is a great example of that. How is it that the narratives about philosophy are different in different places? I mean, that's an interesting question. Who are the figures that you talk about and who don't you talk about when you're telling those stories about philosophy? That's a good question. We could look at the cognates and related concepts of place, just as place itself suggests many related concepts. We could determine why a particular version of a concept has currency in a place. Like why does a particular concept matter so much to a certain group of people, whereas it doesn't seem to matter much at all to a different group of people somewhere else? It's doing some work. And I'm really interested in the kind of work that concepts do. I was talking to Suleiman Bashir Diagne and some others at one point about doing a kind of digital project which looked at the concept of Ubuntu across Africa and the different ways that it and its cognates were deployed in different places and at different times across Africa, right? Because it's not the same, right? I mean, it sometimes tends to get thought of as a kind of singular sort of notion, but I don't really think it actually is. And it's doing different work in these different places, and so we thought it would be really interesting if we had just a kind of digital visualization of being able to move, across the continent and be able to see the ways in which it was used and maybe even how it develops or how influence happens from one place to another. We never actually ended up doing that project. I think it's still an interesting one to do. But that's an example of something that could be done to better understand how it is that concepts travel and have influences in new places and get deployed in new ways. I mean, the uses in South Africa among certain groups of people using Ubuntu for the kind of black middle and upper class to get support for them is a far cry from how it's used elsewhere in Africa or even elsewhere in South Africa sometimes. So that's interesting to me. All right, number 4. Internalist versus externalist notions of persons. I think this is really interesting as well. Often in the West we think of persons in terms of internalist definitions. You are who you are as a person because of what's inside of you, right? Your character, your ideas, all of those sorts of things. You look inside to figure out who you are as a person. If we look in at least some theories of personhood in Africa, we have what I'm going to call an externalist version of a person. You are who you are because of the connections that you have. Now that's an interesting difference, and I don't want to be so reductive as to say it's only one or the other of those, and that there's no shadings of difference among those. Of course there are. But I think what's interesting in that is that we recognize that externalist notion of persons, and yet we don't ask what those relationships actually look like, right? So We say in something like Ubuntu, I am because we are. Great. What does that mean, right? Well, one way to think about it is that there's some sort of network happening, because if it's external connections, then we have networks. Well, here's some network topologies, right? And this is taken straight from like internet topologies. This is how we think about internet communication. But if we're going to talk about an externalist version of persons as one that has connections between people, do we want to start asking how do those kinds of connections work? In other words, do we have a hierarchical version in which what you're doing is looking to an older generation for direction and the younger generation simply follows that? Maybe that's the ideal in some people's minds, but it's not necessarily how it actually works. And if that's not how it works, how do we actually get some notion of that externalist version of persons that has a different kind of network? What does network mean? What does connection mean for us? There's a lot more I could say about these external versions of persons, but I'll leave it for the moment. Here's another idea. I think philosophy instinctively goes back to the beginning, and however it defines beginnings, right? It asks where we came from, our ideas came from, and I think in African philosophy is no different in that, and so we can ask what it means to go back to the beginning of thought. For some people that means looking historically, excavating a history of textuality, a history of orality, things of this nature, in order to be able to establish a kind of flow of thought from a particular point on. So that's one way of cashing out that notion of the originary. For other philosophers, as you know, the question is, for phenomenologists, is to the things themselves. That's the starting point. That's where you start. So what does it mean to explicate the things themselves? There are many ways of going back to a starting point. One way that we've seen recently in African philosophy is the notion of the wellspring. So the wellspring is a notion that is not about an origin, but is about where do we go that continually feeds philosophy. In other words, where is it that we can, with the well, you go back there every day for water. It's not just, it starts there and then you forget about the well, or it recedes into time immemorial. It's something that sustains you, it nourishes you. So what is it that nourishes philosophy? Theophilus Okere, in one of his books, wrote about philosophy and non-philosophy. And I think that's an important kind of question. I wouldn't exactly agree with him on how he defined those things, but I think he asked the right question there. What is non-philosophy in African philosophy? Right? In other words, what is it that philosophy is in a certain sense trying to philosophize, to turn into philosophy? Is it tradition? Is it religion? Is it, it could be any number of things. But I think understanding that point is understanding, in a certain sense, the wellspring, where the lifeblood of philosophy actually comes from. We could look at these tension, as I say, those kind of 6 ways of thinking about place. I think, they exist in kinds of tensions with each other. And so we could ask those questions within African philosophy itself. What are the tensions between a micro-focus on African places and the lived experience in multi-ethnic communities? What are the tensions between focusing on the past, on origins, and focusing on the future? So Afrofuturism or African futurism. What is the tension between conceiving place as being about individual and group agency versus place being about a node of a network? What are the tensions between seeing place as fatally compromised by colonialism and all that came with it, and seeing the same place as a potential for hope? I think Achille Mbembe has written quite eloquently on those questions, starting with On the Post-Colony back in 2000 or so, and in several works since then. What theory of place can help understand the non-human world in Africa? So we're starting to see more and more work, I think, on environmentalism in Africa. For a long time, I think a lot of African philosophy was very much centered around human action. And that raised the question of what do we think about the rest of the world? And so I think people are trying to do that now. Well, that's place as well, isn't it? And so now we have a new set of questions that come out of African experience of the world, not just simply out of some sort of universal experience. We could talk about African theories of time and place. How does time relate to all of this? We could talk about vitalism, not just as a kind of romantic sort of theory of spirit, but as a kind of creative impulse that manifests the new in places. So as I say here, place is the potentiality of time. Time gives urgency to place. And finally, it raises the question of how we ask questions. And this is near and dear to my heart because this is the book I'm working on next, The Question of Questions. So in an African place, what does asking a new question look like? And I think that's maybe a harder thing to ask than it may seem on the surface, right? I think a lot of questions can be very easily fall into the kind of traditional way that questions have been asked. Well, what does it mean to step out of that? I think there's an interesting potential happening there. And so all of this has been meant to say that I think these two kinds of major projects that I've had on place have a very fruitful kind of intersection between them. There's a lot that can be raised as new avenues and new ways of thinking about place. I think much of what we're going to see at this workshop is a testament to that. I am very heartened actually to see that the focus on place in this workshop is not simply a cultural place, which it often has been, but on places like the classroom and places like journals and institutional structures and all of those sorts of things. Those are places too. And I think they have not gotten enough attention. And so I'm very glad to see that they're going to be given attention at this conference. So you're probably wondering why there's been fish throughout this entire thing. Why all the fish? Well, so these are from the aquarium in Cape Town, and I think they speak to some elements of place. They're in flow, they're not static. They're in relation, but they are also individuals. Their materiality matters, but it is not fixed. They respond in the moment, and their place can display some amazing collective organization and emergent properties. If you've ever watched fish in a school swim, you can be absolutely amazed by what they do. They are in place, but at the same time, they are also creating their place. So place is not a possession, but a performance. So, I think these fish that I've been, suggesting to you through this entire talk are a really interesting way of thinking about place. We often think about water as being no place, just like the early modernists who didn't, or the medieval people, who made their maps without drawing the water in, without mapping the water. It's no place. Actually, it is a place, right? And maybe it gets us out of our static notion of what place is to something more like performance, more like engagement, more like relation. And that, I think, is a healthy move. So with that, I thank you. Oh, yeah, and that's a jellyfish.
Yes, thank you so much for this wonderful keynote, which gives us a lot of food for thought. I think we still have some minutes left for discussion, so please, the floor is open for questions and comments. Christiana, please.
Hello.
Alexi, so should I start? As you like.
Okay. First of all, I want to thank you, Professor Janz.
Just put the microphone for the recording here. You can.
Okay. Thank you. So I've really worked with your book, this idea of place. I wrote an article sometime in 2000. German is my place in my head. Okay, 2021. And it's about, is there a place for conversational thinking? Is there a place for conversational thinking in German-Austrian space? And what motivated me was that text because of the way you worked with the concept. So I'm happy that I'm here today to also listen to you break it down. I agree with you on some points. Some points needs reflection and all that. But my comment is that I will start first of all with one of the comments you made in your text, whether the white space or place is ready. I mean, it's a long quote. I quoted it in that article. That whatever that comes from this African place is not even a problem. But the question is the readiness of those who have decided to create Africa in this imaginary form, whether they are willing and ready, to give Africa a space. Now, I have a story I told in one of my presentations about the tortoise. I mean, you know the tortoise? So the tortoise was invited to a meal.
Right.
And somewhere, here is the meal, and there's a bowl for washing of your hands. So everybody has the same condition. So you wash your hand there, and you come and sit down. But for the tortoise, it's quite difficult. So because he had to walk. So each time it washes its hands, the hand will be on the floor. It will be dirty. It will wash again. It will be dirty. So kept repeating that before the tortoise could finish. The food is the meal is over. Which means the standard that was set didn't even suit tortoise from the beginning. The tortoise was excluded. That is just the summary of this whole thing. So my question is, when we think of context, so the first question is, how do context relate to place? And how can we exercise relativism from this idea of place? Second is, how can we understand place with your definition of performance as a place of epistemic agency, whether it is collective agency or individual agency. Third is the idea of I and this we consciousness. So, which you completely, your critique of it, I accept it completely. But then, how will the I in this place be able to be a willing, conscious subject or agency that enters into the we, embodying the place of itself and the place that it transits to, like the fish you described. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. There's a lot to talk about there, I think. First on the question of context, I take context to be in part of some of these versions of place, right? So, in other words, place isn't just a singular thing that then we ask, what's happening around. It's a complex thing which is interacting with other complex things around it. And sometimes those complex interactions produce what you might think of as emergent conditions, new things that couldn't be predicted, from either of the kind of places. So, as far as the question of urgency, I completely agree with you on that question. And I think that can be kind of parsed in different sorts of ways, right? We can think about it as in terms of pushing back against intolerable conditions of some sort that have maintained themselves in some cases for decades or for centuries. I guess I take as some of my intellectual inspiration the history of philosophical feminism, because what I see there has been a transition from the argument among feminists that there needs to be a space for women. They need to have the same education, the same rights as men. All of that's good. But there came a point at which it became clear that they had convinced everyone that they were going to convince, right? Those who were not open to this idea, that no amount of talking was going to convince them that women ought to have anything like equality. And so I feel like there was a turn that was made. And then the turn was towards really a more palatial version of feminism. It might be cashed out as second or third rate feminism, but what it ends up being is an and attention to the concepts that are made available by women's experience. And so you get care ethics, you get standpoint epistemology, you get different politics, deliberative politics. You get all sorts of things that come out of women's experience. You get non-white women's experience in all of this as well. And so you get the Kohambi Collective in the US talking about questions of identity in a particular way. A lot of this gets co-opted and captured by opponents, right? But nonetheless, there are concepts that develop out of their experience that are powerful and rich, as far as I'm concerned. And that all came about because they stopped asking or answering the wrong question, which was, trying to prove to men, the men who would not listen, that they deserve a space too. Now it's the time. What concepts do we have? And as it turns out, there are a lot of them, and they're very rich. I don't think you can teach ethics today without taking feminist ethics into account as part of the mix, right? I mean, it's that powerful. It's not just some kind of, this is just for women, or something like that. And so for me, that's what I'm seeing, the turn in African philosophy. Among some philosophers, certainly in North America, African philosophy is seen as this little regionalist thing. Well, maybe if you're African, you're interested. No, I mean, there are concepts coming out of African experience that should be there for everyone, right? Just like, feminist philosophy generated concepts that have changed the very face of philosophy itself. So that, for me, is the hopeful moment. And it's a hopeful moment in the midst of the fact that gender discrimination has not gone away. And in many cases, it's gotten worse, right? And yet, there's still a creative potential there. So I don't think you have to solve the problem of marginalization and discrimination before you can start creating in a place. I think you can already start. I had this conversation with Tendai Sethole a couple of years ago in Bayreuth, actually, and I think he did it really interestingly by looking at music, particularly jazz. And we talked about Miles Davis and the development of jazz, and Miles Davis was very aware of the kind of discriminatory nature of American society. And as a black musician in American society, there's places he couldn't go, and he was marginalized, and yet what does he do? He creates. And he creates, and he creates, and he creates, and he just does something. He's restless. He does something new, and he does something new, and he does something new. And in a certain sense, that is the answer, or an answer, to that kind of persistent rejection, is to just make a world.
Thank you, Bruce. There is another question. Paul?
Yeah, thank you, Bruce, a lot for the really inspiring paper. I have 3 points. Mm-hmm. The first one is, I think you may be aware of the modern Japanese philosopher Nishida Kitaro.
Yeah, absolutely.
Of course, because you did not included him into your list about the place, because he made up a so-called logic of place.
Yeah.
In 1926 already, going back to Kora, to the Platonic theory of place, which also at Casey uses and in his chronology. So this is just a historical remark, but Nishida developed the notion of place to the notion of world. Yeah. World and worlds. Right. Also in the plural, and you also just mentioned this world and worlds. And the first question would be the relation between place and worlds. Right. And I just add the editor of the series of the histories of philosophy of the Überweg. They decided for the Arabic history of philosophy, they decided to take the title Philosophy in the Islamic World. Right. No, not in the Africa or something, in the world. Right. And so there's an interesting connection between place and world. The second is, in Japanese, we have an interesting discussion about the performance which is connected to the place. So Nishida uses basho.
Yep.
And Nishitani is criticizing him because he said basho is only static, but the other word, tokoro, is performative, as you pointed out.
With the fish,
Yeah.
yes.
And so we have at least two terms in Japanese.
Yep.
One is more static and one is more performative.
Right.
And so you talked about space and place, but also we have locus, no? Or something like that, and context, which was just mentioned. And this is, I think, interesting. And we have one more, which comes from Latin, situ, situation. And this is the last question, the connection between place and situation. Is a place much more a situation? And then you brought in time. There's another old Japanese word, jisho, that is a word for time, place. Combining both time and place in one word. And this is quite interesting because you mentioned time, because always if we think about a place, then it tends to be a little bit static.
Yeah.
No?
Often
But
it does.
we don't have a word which combines two, the time and place.
Right.
And in German we have another word, Ort.
Right.
And we can build the word Zeitort, time, place. And so place and world,
Yeah.
place and situation,
Yeah.
and different words, possibilities to combine time and place.
Yeah. Thank you for that. There's a lot there. I've written on Watsuji Tetsuro and Fudo, which I think is another kind of interesting approach to questions around place. So, place in the world. At the end of one of Achille Mbembe's books, is it Necropolitics? No, it's Critique of Black Reason. The epilogue is called "There Is Only One World," and I take that seriously, even though I also recognize that we can clearly talk about multiple worlds, even in a particular place, like sports world, the music world, whatever. So what I take to be the operative and interesting aspect to that is what I think of as play. Okay, so play is not just entertainment or pastime or something like that. Play, in a certain sense, is the kind of performative experimentation that we do to test out new ways of doing things. So it may occur in sports. I mean, play may occur in sports. It may not. I mean, you might just run a formation or something in sports, and it's really not play because everyone is just doing exactly what they're supposed to do, and to get to the end product, which is to win the game. But when you're truly playing, it seems to me, and you're doing something that puts place and time together, as you suggest, right? Because of the iterations, the trying and trying over, and all of those sorts of things. You are taking into account the notion that the world is, in some sense, rule-governed, right? There are rules. If you are trying to play something, but there are no kind of expectations or rules or anything like that, it's simply randomness. It's not really play at that point. And so you're operating within a space that has been defined in some sense. Now, maybe those are written down in a book. Maybe they are simply part of a tradition. Maybe they are part of a language, any number of different things. But this, to me, I mentioned the word event, and this, to me, is where place and time come together, in that notion that in a moment, with play, something new can happen, right? Or maybe you're solidifying as a habit something that you've done before, right? And habits are important too. So, I mean, the Japanese tradition is, yes, I should have included them, and they are hugely informative and important on all of this as well, because they have attended to place in important ways. I would like to see more attention to that within the African space as well, because I think that there is work on place in African philosophy, not just mine but others, that I think can tease out some interesting things on place there as well. Situation, I think we can see that within worlds. Our situation is, in a certain sense, our set of conditions under which we operate, the parameters, the things that we think are possible and things that we think are not possible to do. That is our situation. So, you know, and more than that, but that at least.
The meaning of the word in Latin is place.
Right. Yes.
Situ.
Yeah. Right. Exactly. Yeah.
In situ.
Okay, we have two more questions. Professor Lashat and Professor Dorothy. Sorry. Afterwards.
Thank you for the great conversation on this topic of place, because it's interesting me also, and in the connection with Professor Rolf, the philosophy in Islamic world, and in the connection of the book of Anke Grimes, the philosophy in Africa. This is the problem of place. And I have this problem with my students. In my experience as a philosopher from North Africa, when I try to show them that there is African philosophy, just they ask me, really, there is African philosophy? But my initiative is try to show them that we are in North Africa, we forget that we are apart from Africa.
Right.
So why you put this, they raise this question when I try to talk with them to African philosophy.
Right.
And I try to extend the concept of the space, because I try to show them that North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, it is an invention, imagination. So, but when I talk to them about Africa, about philosophy in Islamic world, they don't put this question. Because there is another connection. So the space, I think that play an important role in the history of philosophy.
Yeah.
For that reason, philosophy in North Africa, for example, is very influenced by the Arabic and Islamic
Right.
tradition.
Right.
But in my experience, there is many connection with the Sub-Saharan Africa.
Right.
But this is a long story about the colonialism,
Yes.
which still has influence about the mentality of the population on North Africa, as Morocco, Tunisia, and Algeria, and so forth.
Yeah.
Other thing, it is just a small question when you mentioned Suleiman Bashir Dian. I mentioned I remember his book, The Meaning of Timbuktu. To what extent you can explain that this relationship between the history of philosophy and writes a new perspective of philosophy in global perspective, that Suleiman Bashir Dian take the meaning of Timbuktu as a place in order to show that African philosophy is also in Timbuktu. However, Timbuktu, we forget that Timbuktu, because in the past is dominated by Al-Qarawiyyin and other places in North Africa.
Right.
But Timbuktu is also a symbol.
Right.
And I think that Suleiman Bashir Dian takes this concept of place in order to show that philosophy in Africa is also related to a place as a Timbuktu.
Right.
And
Right.
thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, the struggle with your students, I can understand that. I can see that it would be real. You know, when I sometimes say to my students, you know, the United States was the world's first modern nation, and Canada was the world's first postmodern nation. And the reason I say that is that the US looks back to a formative document, and it always measures itself against that formative document. Well, maybe not in recent years, but before, normally. It looks back to the Declaration of Independence and all of the rest of that, and it says, okay, so that's what formed us, and this is who we are. In Canada, if you grew up in Canada, you know that Canada doesn't make sense as a country. I mean, there are deep divides, you know, between English and French, between what we call First Nations and the rest of the country. Canada exists as a project, right? And, you know, if you listen to the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, you know, they're always engaged in that project. What does it mean to be Canadian? You know, tell us, what does it mean? And people do all of these different things, and they put on celebrations, and the question remains, because Canada has taken in so many immigrants, and so the question is asked, what does it mean to be Canadian in the context of all these new people in the country that speak 100 different languages, right? It's a project. And so in a certain sense, the place is being established by continually asking, what does it mean to be in this place? As opposed to simply looking back and saying, it's a place, look, there's the documents, and moving from there. And so I wonder, in the case of your students, if putting it in front of them the way you do is a way of asking that question. What does it mean to be doing African philosophy here, north of the Sahara, on the Mediterranean? Look at all the connections. Look at the historical connections. Look at the conversations. Look at all of these different things. Look at the way that the rest of the world has treated this entire continent. I mean, there's lots of compelling reasons for thinking that, all of Africa is in a conversation together, even if they don't see that right now. But it takes asking the question over and over, just like it takes asking what does it mean to be Canadian to make that place what it is. So that seems to me to be the power of the question, I guess I would say, and the power of asking that question and finding ways to make that question a living question for people. Because, in the US, it's only recently been a living question as to ask, what does it mean to be American? So many people just look back and say, oh yeah, there it is, and now people are starting to ask, I think. It's about time. Yes.
Thank you, Professor Ulbabin Jacob.
Thank you, Professor Janz,
Thank you.
for your projects on philosophy in place. It's indeed an eye-opener. And as you were presenting, an idea occurred to me. This philosophy in place immediately translates to contextualizing philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
And that means that there can be multiple places
Mm-hmm.
where this philosophy can take place.
Absolutely.
Or is taking place.
Absolutely.
And when we are talking about intercultural dialogue, it will imply we need to respect different places.
Mm-hmm.
It will also imply questioning and also being sensitive to differences.
Mm-hmm.
My question now is, given this emphasis, how does philosophy in place decolonize philosophical discourse? Because we're talking about philosophizing in a globalized world. So how would this approach help to decolonize philosophical discourse?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, the importance of dialogue is very, very important. I mean, it is, as I said when I made my comments about the history of feminism, there are those who are willing to be in dialogue and there are those who aren't, or who come with their presuppositions that cannot be challenged, right? They already think they know how things are. But there are others who are willing to talk. And, I mean, I've been seeing, groups around the epistemologies of the South. I've been seeing groups, doing all sorts of different things, talking to those who are truly willing to talk. When I first got into African philosophy, I'll tell you how I got in. It was my old friend Emmanuel Eze. Some of you know his work. And I was in Kenya, and he and I ran into each other. Neither of us lived in Kenya, but we ran into each other at the University of Nairobi Philosophy Department. Actually, Oriara, is Oriara here yet? He's coming. Okay, so we met Oriara at the time. So anyway, Emmanuel and I got talking and realized that we had more to talk about, like more in common with each other than either of us had with most of the people in the department. We had similar kind of intellectual backgrounds and stuff like that. And so, he was working in the US at the time, I was working in Canada, and when he got back, he started, emailing me, and he said, I'm doing this book, Post-Colonial African Philosophy, do you want to contribute a chapter? I said, I'm a white Canadian, what are you talking about? What do I have to say in this context? I'm not from that place. I lay no claim to that place, I lay no claim to knowledge about it, and it was Emmanuel that said, yeah, fair enough, what you have to do is learn to listen and learn to dialogue, right? Learn to talk about the things that people care to talk about, not the things that you think they ought to be talking about. Good advice. And so, and he kept pulling me, bit by bit in. He and I and John Pittman were the ones that started Philosophia Africana, actually. Originally, it wasn't called that. It was Journal of African Philosophy at the time, then changed its name. That was another thing he pulled me into. And, what I learned from Emmanuel, I think, is you talk to the people who are willing to talk, to really talk, right? Not to just kind of bring their worldview and see if they can implant it on what they think is going on. And you can tell. I mean, I believe in the gut feeling sometimes. You can tell if somebody's really trying to engage in that conversation or is just, coming from their place and is not to be budged. And so I think the question of decolonization is fostering the conversations where they can be fostered. I still take Achille's work and other people like that very seriously. He is so eloquent at sketching out the deep problematic heritage of colonialism. I mean, very eloquent on that, and yet he ends up his books quite hopeful, right? Like we can. There's one world. We can build a new world. We can move. We learn to live as free people. That's what he says at the end of On the Post-Colony. I take that seriously, and I think the only way that can happen, it's not. There's no global thing that's going to happen. It's going to be the conversations that we can have with people who are willing to converse, and we go from there. And there's no accident that epistemologies of the South has taken off because. There are people who have similar starting points across many countries, and they have a lot to talk about, and I applaud that, right? So that's I guess that's my answer. I'm the white guy Canadian saying this, right? So you have to make up your own minds in a certain sense as to where those conversations might lie, but that's how I've thought about it.
We have two more questions.
Thank you. Okay. I want to greet you, Professor, for your great work.
Thank you.
Have you never been in Africa?
Oh, many times. Many times.
Many times?
I taught at University of Nairobi. I taught at Rhodes. Yeah.
Okay. It's good. I want to ask you two questions. African philosophy is not just a theoretical reflection, but it's also a battleground for the valorization of African knowledge and the tradition in face of a dominant Western paradigm. So, when addressing the questions of African philosophy in a term of space, how will you evacuate these considerations? Is it my first question? The second, how do you address the diversity of space usage across different regions of Africa in order to build a global African philosophy? African philosophy.
Yeah, thank you for those questions. So, to the second one first, I think, so I used the notion of a focal length before. I mentioned it in passing. And what I meant by that was the idea that some of the questions that we have are about very specific places, and some of them are about, if you wish, intermediate places, and some of them are about very kind of large-scale places. So I think it does make sense. Like some of my, Western colleagues who don't know anything about African philosophy think that they have the gotcha question. Oh, but how can there be an African philosophy when there's so many people there and so many different cultural groups and so many things, this and that and other thing? And my answer to that is, yeah, you're right. Of course. I mean, there are many different kind of traditions, but Africa was also treated in a particular way by Europe and by the Western world. It was described in a particular way, and so there are certain kinds of questions, I think, that accrue to the continent because of that history of colonialism, slavery, and apartheid. And so depending on our focal length, I think we can ask different kinds of questions. The questions that we tend to ask about all of Africa tend to be those anti-colonial questions, because that's how the entire continent gets described. Once we start gutting it out into Yoruba philosophy or Kikuyu or whatever, we're asking different sorts of questions usually, even though the lived experience of people in those places was also an experience of being marginalized, on a world stage and so forth. But I think what I'm interested in where the creative blood is. What does it mean to create something in African philosophy? Not just describe how things have been, but to create. That's why early on I pushed, there needs to be a African philosophy of the digital, right? Because so much philosophy I saw, this was like a decade or two ago, it was as if, the digital world didn't exist, and yet absolutely everyone had a cell phone, right? Well, it's part of human experience in Africa. Shouldn't we be thinking about that? Shouldn't there be an African understanding of what that means within an African space? I'm happy to say now that I'm seeing more stuff come out on that. So I think there are, ways of creating concepts adequate to the lived experience of people now. But the idea that we need to push back against colonialism, I think, will never go away, because I think there's never going to be a point at which that project is finally completed. And that's the bad news. But I get that from Derek Bell, who is the theorist of race and racism in the US, and he made the same case about racism. He said, racism is never going to go away. What's going to happen is that you think you've defeated it, and the tactics change, and the language changes, and this changes, and it goes underground, and it does this, and it does that, and it maintains itself in all sorts of different ways. So you have to start asking a different question, not how do we defeat racism, but how do we live with the lived existence of this, and how do we create and have a life for who we are? That, to me, is a better question, and I think it also applies to questions around colonialism as well. Given that, it's going to, especially on the world stage, there's going to be ways of reconfiguring those unequal relationships, economic, political, all of those things. Yes, you have to fight against those, no question. But you also have to live. You also have to create. You also have to have a rich life. What does that look like?
Thank you. Thank you for your remarks. And you have said a lot of things, but I can sum up it a lot of time. When you speak, I was thinking about one author you don't mention in your speak. It's Glissant from Martinique.
Yeah.
And one book, Philosophy of Relation. And I think that a lot of things you said can be related to his book.
Yeah.
Have you read it? And
Glissant is hugely important, and yes, I have read Glissant.
And how can you use it for your purpose on place, because place is not a possession. You said that place is performance, and performance, is it in philosophy or in art or in literature or in theater? How can I use that?
Well, yeah, I mean, Glissant, so in my last book, which is on an activism, I have 2 chapters, and I thought about making one of them on Glissant, but the first one was on Sylvia Wynter, and the last one was on Suzanne Césaire, okay? And so in both of those, you get elements of Glissant picked up, I think, in both those places, and especially around performance, especially around the notion that place is something that we are enacting and something that we're building. And so, I confess part of the reason I went with Sylvia Wynter and Suzanne Césaire is that I wanted 2 women, who were eloquent on these things, in this book. And so, but yeah, Glissant, I could easily have done that in my latest book. And I think, what Glissant gives us is that, that notion that decolonizing is that kind of step-by-step notion of performing something new that gives us a new way of seeing the world. So in other words, we're not following a script that was laid down by someone else. We're engaging in our own script. Yeah, Glissant is a hugely important writer, and thank you for mentioning it.
We have a last question over there.
So I would thank you for your presentation, even though I didn't get the whole gist of the matter.
and I just came maybe 5 minutes towards the end of the presentation, and it looks very interesting because right now I'm working on something that is connected to world, and I'm operating with much of the phenomenological paradigms of the definition of the discourse on world. Heidegger and all the rest of them, Lacoste, the French phenomenologist. And so you said that you said a lot of things about place. At the end, I had things of performance and relativity. So because we know we are talking about place in philosophy, there are a lot of people, maybe we talk about in the phenomenological world, Husserl talking about the body, experience of the body, and also other people are talking about a place of subjectivity.
Right.
And others talk about the area of Kora, and even goes into the architectural or even the political discourse connected about place. These are particular experiences. My question, because I didn't get the whole gist, I just got maybe the tail of it, would be, so what your research, what real experiences, or could we say that? Maybe real lived experiences, that could be found in African philosophy in terms of place. So, place would then mean sort of discourse in African philosophy. And I want to ask, just like, it's a question of curiosity. So what are the potential areas where we could, relate this idea of place as a lived experience in African philosophy?
Thank you. Yeah, and I ran through a few of those before you came to the talk. I ran through a number of ways in which I think questions of place can be applied within Africa around, once you sort out the different kind of structures of place that I kind of laid out in the talk, I think that raises questions about how we think about place in Africa. Do we think about it in terms of phenomenological human experience? Do we think about it in terms of structure and semiotic connection between elements? Do we think about it in terms of material, construction a la Lefebvre, something like that? But if you want to just kind of bring it down to more familiar human experience, I suppose, I think there are ways of philosophy moving out of the classroom and out of the journal in Africa. I mean, this is true anywhere, but one of the things that Stephen Biko did in South Africa in the 60s, I think, was once the avenues for conversation were cut off, once political parties were banned, once people were put in jail, he did not say, well, I guess the game's over. He said, we need to find a different space for the development of concepts. And what were the spaces he found? Well, some of them were the universities, but not the classrooms particularly. It was like, rallies and things. It was the townships. It was the factories. It was all sorts of places like this. He was in dialogue with what was going on in the American Civil Rights movement and reading, the literature from that. And they were reading what he was writing. And so in a certain sense, I take that as a kind of model for looking at where the creative spaces might be. And if some spaces are closed off, well, where are they available? I'm asking that question for myself, not in an African context, but we're living under some restrictions in the US right now about what you can and can't talk about in classes. And the government will claim that it's still free inquiry, but it's very much not. And so now we have to ask, what does it mean to truly have intellectual integrity in this age, in this moment? And it might not be in a university, it might be in another kind of space. In some countries it has been, small group meetings where people have met to discuss ideas. So I think the places of thinking can vary depending on the circumstances. But the other thing I'll say about it is that concepts don't always come from us. They come from people who find them useful in various ways. And so I would go into the world, in Africa, in wherever, to ask where, how are people talking about freedom, for example? There's one concept. How are people talking about equality? How are people talking about any of these concepts? How are they developing those? What examples are they using? Can we understand what's going on? So there's a kind of, I guess, applied, not applied philosophy in the sense of, here I have my philosophical ideas, now I'm going to apply them in the world. It's kind of the other way around. You know, I'm now starting to ask, how are people actually using concepts? Maybe they're not the way I think they should be using them, but that doesn't matter right now. There's a kind of almost sociological side to philosophy at that point, or anthropological side to philosophy, where we can start pulling that stuff out and then start being in dialogue with those communities and start actually developing those concepts, not to steal them from those groups, but hopefully to work in partnership with them so that, you know, some of these concepts can be articulated in a new way. You know, I think especially concepts like freedom, which some groups just want to own. You know, we know what freedom is. Well, no, freedom might just mean following their beliefs or dictates or something like that, but maybe freedom means something very different somewhere else. So that to me is part of attending to place, right? These things happen in place. These concepts matter in a place and they develop in a place. And I think maybe it's up to us to try and work with those people and draw those out and see what's actually going on there, because I think there's a richness to that kind of discourse that could be really great for philosophy. So.
Just a minute.
Okay.
Because of what he just said now. No, rather than focusing on concepts, why don't we just focus on the question that brought about the concept?
Mm-hmm.
Because focusing on the concept may not even help the person to enter the world of the person who's using the concept. So that what was the question that was asked?
Yeah.
Where this concept now came in as a way of responding to the question.
I completely agree with you, and maybe the concept is the entry door to the question. Mm-hmm. You say freedom, but you seem to not be using them the same way. So
yeah, exactly.
So yeah, but the question is in the end the actual thing that matters. I preach this to my students all the time. Okay. You know, and in fact, the next book I'm writing is on questions and questioning. So yeah, you hit a happy place for me. That's absolutely right.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you so much for your
Thank you.
keynote lecture. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.